Welcome everyone to our RSM Federal Budget Update for 2020. Today you will hear analysis and insights from the team at RSM and also a panel, including some of the top commentators in the country. We have economist Craig James from CommSec, veteran personal finance columnist Effie Zahos. My name is Andrew Sykes and I'm a director of RSM's business advisory team. I'll be your host for today. When we look back on last year, the government's economic plan outlined in the 1920 budget was marketed as building a stronger economy and securing a better future for all Australians. The government had planned on doing this by returning the budget to surplus, delivering more jobs, providing lower taxes, while guaranteeing essential services like Medicare, schools, hospitals and roads. 2020 was going to see the first budget surplus in over a decade. We were looking great. We had an economy set to grow by 2.75% and unemployment at 4.9%. The government was talking about paying its own way and reducing national debt. This all began to unravel in December 2019 as a series of devastating bushfires swept across the country. At one stage, it seemed like the whole country was in flames. Little did we know at this time that worse was to come. The impact of COVID-19 has been a severe challenge to our economy and the government. So much so that the Treasurer announced on 20 March that the budget would be deferred until 6 October. What we've had delivered last night is a budget that has been delivered in the face of generational challenge as Australia enters its first recession in 30 years. Let's start with our usual review of this year's budget newspapers and see what the major papers are saying. The editor of The Australian must be a fan of early 90s rock, with a reference to the influential U2 album cover. Their focus is on the tax cuts and the business incentives that are the plan to get Australia out of recession. Meanwhile, Sydney Morning Herald has gone a little sombre this year without the colour of its rivals. However, it seems to have really picked up on the messaging from the government about jobs and their importance in the pathway to recovery. The focus for the Australian Financial Review is on debt and how this cash splash is going to be funded. They're noting some of the scarier numbers in the budget, with debt to top over $1 trillion by 2024. That's about 52% of GDP. I always save my favourite till the last. And of course, like every year, it's the Daily Telly. A big focus on the cash being thrown at the economy, with our Treasurer featured in a wonderful piece of Photoshop creativity. The Daily Telly proving once again that Australian journalism is alive and well. I will introduce our panel members shortly, but first a little housekeeping. We've produced a budget alert. The team at RSM worked throughout the night to produce this. Our free report covers all the detail you need to understand the budget. I'm going to have one of my assistants now upload a link in the comments section. If you click on this link, it'll take you through to the budget alert report. I encourage you to click on the link and download the report. If you have any issues, just type in a comment and someone will assist you. We're going to have some questions today and you'll have the chance to submit questions throughout this session. We'll address those after the formal component of the webinar is completed. Your questions, if they're specifically directed to a panelist, note who it is you'd like to ask a question of. And as I said, when we get to the formal component, we'll answer your questions that you've typed in. We'll also provide a summary of the Q&A, addressing any of the RSM tax questions in an email post this webinar, along with a link to the webinar recording. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Tony Fulton, Director in our Melbourne Tax Services Division. Tony has over 25 years corporate tax experience and specialises in providing corporate and international tax services to ASX and multinational companies. Tony was leading the RSM team who developed our budget publication overnight. Thanks for joining us, Tony. You and your team spent all night grading the budget. How's your report card looking?
Thanks, Andrew. Well, from a tax person's point of view, this was certainly a more interesting budget. I'd like to share some of the key changes that arose from the budget last night. I think some of those changes are perhaps, very interesting from a tax person's perspective, and it's certainly been a standout in some specific areas. Let me just share my screen just to talk through perhaps some of the more interesting areas. Look, without any doubt at all, the instant asset write-off measure is probably the most significant in the budget. It provides a major benefit to businesses, and it is a significant extension on the existing instant asset write-off, with providing the ability for businesses with turnover of up to $5 billion to achieve an immediate write-off for expenditure on new plant and equipment. That policy applies from last night, so it's available immediately and is uncapped in terms of the amount of expenditure that it can apply to. The second piece for corporates is the introduction or reintroduction of the tax loss carryback provisions. With this applies to companies that also have turnover less than $5 billion, so will apply to a wide range of corporates. Again, this is reflecting the fact that many companies will have incurred losses during the COVID crisis, and this provides them with the ability to carry back those losses, obtaining a tax refund against tax paid in earlier years. So again, that measure in conjunction with the instant asset write-off is going to provide significant benefit to taxpayers. On the small to mid-sized businesses front, haven't been forgotten. We're seeing an expansion of the availability of small business tax concessions to companies with turnover, being extended from the existing threshold of 10 million through to 50 million turnover. So again, a significant expansion of concessions available to mid-sized business. This will cover a range of things, including immediate tax deductions, and access to FBT exemptions on car parking, availability of devices to staff, and a range of other concessions. So again, a welcome addition and expansion to the small business tax concessions. On the innovation front, some sense has prevailed on the R&D tax incentive law changes that were announced in the previous year's budget. They will not change retrospectively, and there have been a couple of refinements to it going forward. So that provides companies with confidence that the R&D tax incentive rules will remain the same for the current year. There's a scrapping of the cap on refundable R&D for companies, and a refinement of the R&D intensity rules that were announced last year. So again, good news for those companies involved in the innovation sector. Again, a very welcome addition to the budget. On the individual front, everyone wants to know how the budget's going to affect their hip pocket. The government has delivered here by bringing forward the stage 2 tax rate changes. That basically brings forward from July 2022 the stage 2 reductions, mainly directed at low to middle income individuals. Unfortunately, the government didn't take the opportunity to bring forward the stage 3 changes, which were, seen as providing a benefit to the middle and upper income. They will remain as effective from 1 July 2024. But in any case, good news for individuals, and certainly a measure that we will see, should assist with the stimulating consumer spending. Look, overall, from our review of the budget overnight, and it was a long night, there was a lot in it for tax people. I'd describe it as a budget that was appropriate for the now. It was a good response to the need to create immediate stimulus. Do I think it addresses the longer term structural needs and changes required to the Australian tax system? No, not yet. And so our perspective is that we think we need to watch this space. There's some heavy lifting still to be done by the government in future in terms of genuine and long-lasting tax reform. I'll hand it back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Tony. You can find more detail in the report prepared by Tony and the RSM team of experts. I'll have one of my assistants put up that link again in the comments section so you can download our free reports. Also appreciate your patience during a couple of communications difficulties there. This is the first time in 8 years we've done this as a national broadcast. So today in the studio, I have Paul Bongiorno joining me. Paul is a columnist at the Saturday paper and a 30-year veteran political journalist and commentator. After leaving the priesthood in 1974, he began working in television, winning 4 Walkley Awards for his investigative journalism. He hosted 10's national Sunday morning show, Meet the Press, from 1996 to 2012, and in more recent times has been a regular contributor to the Saturday paper and a commentator on ABC Radio. Paul was made a member of the Order of Australia for his service to the print and broadcast media as a journalist, political commentator and editor. I also have online Craig James, Chief Economist at CommSec. Craig has a knack for making economics user-friendly. Craig's current role is Chief Economist at CommSec, interpreting big picture economic and financial trends for customers, clients and staff. Craig has worked in banking, finance and journalism and holds both bachelor and master's degrees in commerce from the University of New South Wales. He's an adjunct professor at Curtin Business School in Perth. With me also is Effie Zahos, editor-at-large from Canstar. Effie is one of Australia's leading personal finance commentators with more than 2 decades of experience, helping Aussies make the most of their money. Known for her no-nonsense approach, she's a knack for making money matters simple. Perhaps best known for her former role as the editor of Money magazine, having helped establish it in 1999, Effie is now editor-at-large for Canstar, Australia's biggest financial comparison website. This sees her leverage the brand's digital platform in pursuit of improving Australians' understanding of their personal finances and helping more people confidently make money decisions. So we're going to now ask some questions of our panel. So Paul, the Prime Minister says this is the most important budget since World War II. Did it live up to the hype?
Well, I think the numbers made sure that it exceeded the hype, I'd have to say. I mean, a budget with $213 billion deficit and contributing $50 billion to debt, going out over the forward estimates to $1 trillion is something that, well, basically I've never seen in 30 years of reporting federal politics. And as the Treasurer pointed out last night, we haven't really seen a recession like this since the Great Depression. In fact, some commentators are saying that we are facing a depression rather than a recession. Now, the government has tried to come to grips with this COVID pandemic-induced horror show by attacking both the demand side and the supply side of the economy. And our demand has been weak because people are scared, they lack confidence, because many have lost their jobs, and those who haven't lost their jobs fear that they will, which is a very dangerous political cocktail, certainly for a government who ever wants to be re-elected. On the demand side, or supply side rather, those massive tax cuts for business, you know, they're tax incentives rather than tax cuts, but whatever you want to call them, they are massive. And if it works, it'll be terrific. There is a question mark over that. I mean, business, even if you make it very easy for them to invest, are they going to invest in things that they don't feel people are going to buy, just to put it very simply? The other point about the tax cuts, to get a tax cut, you've got to have an income. And if you've got an income, but you're a bit worried about how long you're going to have an income, you might actually bank it rather than go out and spend it. That's why we still have left over, after this massive splurge of a budget, we still have left over today a big discussion amongst economists and others about would it have been better to be more generous to the unemployed through job seeker, with the realisation that what is it, 150,000 that the budget says are going to join the unemployment queue in the next couple of months, would they have been better off being given more money? Because when you haven't got any discretion but to spend to live, you're going to definitely play a big part in stimulating demand in the economy.
Terrific. Thanks, Paul. So, Craig, noting some of Paul's comments and some pretty big numbers that are thrown out there, could the government have done more?
Andrew, it's the old economic problem. You could always do more, you know, so it's the economic problem. You've got unlimited ways to be able to spend your money. There's limited ways that you've dollars that you've got available to you. So you speak to the self-funded retirees and say, yes, they could have done more. They could have provided a little bit of a handout to us. The homelessness Australia have had a cut back in terms of their funding, over this budget, as well. When you look around the economy, the job seeker and the job keeper, payments, those people on job seeker said, yes, you could have, maintained the unemployment benefits at that higher rate for a longer period of time. But I think we've got to recognise what the government, has been doing. It's really much a scattergun approach in terms of spending measures. Infrastructure, they've got, a lot more dollars, and that's going to lift a lot of boats right the way across the country. The benefits to business sector, as Paul mentioned, so the more business incentives to be able to take on, workers and to be able to invest in and to be able to spend. The tax cuts that have been provided, the $250, 2 lots of $250 payments to pensioners and those people on welfare. So certainly, so there's got the handouts there. And then there's the small matter of the money that going out to regional areas. So there's lots of dollars that are being spent. And indeed, of course, we had to spend the money. We had no all sorts of alternatives. So what we've got to do is be very, very aggressive in terms of making sure that this recession, we believe it's only going to be a very short recession, doesn't turn into a depression. And the way to do that is to become very, very aggressive. We saw that in terms of the federal government back in March. We've seen that in terms of the current budget. So certainly we believe that they've really done enough for now. Where we're a little bit disappointed, and I'm echoing what Tony's saying here, we've got to see more in terms of tax. There's a tax that is applied at a state and territory level, which is basically a payroll tax, which is an acknowledgement, so that the payroll tax, which basically is a tax on jobs. That's still in place, and I would have liked to have seen the federal government dealing with the state and territory governments to be able to get rid of the payroll tax. Stamp duty is another thing which is crying out for a degree of reform. So I think there's a lot more to be done in the tax area, and that's really the area that I think the government's got to pursue in coming months and years.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Craig. So, Tony, tax seems to be, as Craig's just mentioned, right at the centrepiece of this budget, federal income tax. These instant asset write-offs, are they as good as they seem? Are there any sort of limits to the benefits of this kind of policy that you see?
Yeah, well, I think, Andrew, one of the issues is that the instant asset write-off essentially is a timing difference. It brings forward a benefit that would arise to companies anyway if they were to acquire a new plant. Now, whether or not the benefit of providing that deduction up front is enough to cause businesses to spend, I think remains to be seen. As has been noted, some of these incentives are also limited by the fact that they provide a benefit to companies that are paying tax. And if you don't pay tax, then you don't get the benefit of an instant tax deduction unless you can then access the loss carryback rules. So there is an interrelationship between those two measures. But fundamentally, this is a measure that for tax-paying companies will have some benefits in terms of reduced cash tax payable in the near term. Albeit, again, I suppose borrowing from the future. So it has some limitations in that sense. And so trying to incentivise companies that are in a loss-making position and perhaps have been so for some time, or are in certain sectors or at stages of their development where they're not paying tax as yet, then these sorts of incentives don't tend to drive behaviour in our experience.
So what about, we've seen the increase in the small business tax concessions from companies that had 10 million in turnover up to companies that have 50 million in turnover. What kind of opportunities does that produce?
Well, I think this is a welcome change because it certainly starts to move the availability of a range of different concessions. I think we counted up to about 10 that apply under the small business tax concessions that will now be available to a much wider group of companies. Some of the immediate things to come out of the budget itself was the announcement that there would be an FBT exemption on car parking. I think post-COVID-19, there'll certainly be a desire for more people to be driving to the office and parking their cars. So I think that's going to be welcome. There's an exemption that now applies to being able to provide an employee with multiple devices. So that loosens up on the existing FBT exemption. So these are the sorts of things that are available under these small business tax concessions that will be available to a wider group of companies. And so from that perspective, they're very welcome. We'd like to see them go further. We'd certainly like to see some greater simplification in compliance and reduction in some of the red tape that applies to small to mid-sized businesses. So again, we'll be looking to the future to hopefully see those small business tax concessions expand further.
Terrific. And yeah, that's great for corporate Australia, but on the personal side of things, Effie, what impact do you see firstly on pensioners?
Yeah, Andrew, thanks. It was interesting to note last night that 2 payments of $250 will be given to pensioners. Not a lot, and as Paul mentioned at the beginning, I mean, if you're going to try and get people to spend or any type of stimulus, then it is lower income earners. So it would have been nice to see the pensioners or people on family tax benefit or the concessional card or the pension card, that's the eligibility to get these 2 payments, receive a little bit more. Some good news in there, those that were looking for care packages, I believe those numbers have increased. Unfortunately, the numbers that need the highest level to get them out of, say, residential aged care was only limited, I think, 2,000 or 4,000 there, so not that much. Where it was really disappointing, though, was self-funded retirees. as Craig also mentioned. It's a rough trot there because if anyone's income who has seen a dive, it is self-funded retirees. And in a lot of cases, these are people that have put faith into the system of funding themselves, whether that's just through an investment property or their super, finding now that that income has depleted. And it's a case that there's really nothing there for them. One little tip, I guess, because deeming rates are still high, I mean, 2.25%, good luck in finding a term deposit paying you that amount. You may find that you may be eligible for the Commonwealth Senior Card. And if that's the case, that could give you the indoor to getting those two $250 payments. So the tip there is definitely have a look on Centrelink and see if you fall under those thresholds to get, that's that income threshold. A single person is just over 55,000. Unfortunately, I know the National Seniors Australia were looking for so much more to come out, maybe lowering the taper test, the deeming rates to fall, automating investments through Centrelink. There was so much that could have been done, unfortunately wasn't.
Okay, and what about younger people and parents? How's this impacted on them?
Gee, I wish I was under, well, I shouldn't say that. Young people are definitely getting some some good value out of this. I shouldn't want to go backwards and I shouldn't want to be in that position. But look, it was definitely targeted payments for younger people when you look at the job maker credit payments. So those under 30, their employers have an incentive now to actually hire them. And also, tradies at half the price sounds good too. So there's a lot of incentives there as small business people to be hiring younger people. The problem is, in that regard, is that it really did not look after women, unfortunately. Make up half the population, basically a huge cohort of those that were in part-time employment, and when the payments drop off in March, there is nothing there, unfortunately, for, if I'm over 35-year-old woman, I may be taken, lose that position to someone who can be eligible for the job maker. The super part was interesting. That will help young people as well build their super and grow their super. The government recognising the ridiculous fees that are being charged there, and now basically allowing people to move their super as they move jobs automatically, and basically tackling dud super funds as well. They need to perform, and if they're underperforming for 2 years, I believe they are closed for new members.
Okay, so there's been some big numbers thrown around, as Paul mentioned before, and we went through earlier. Craig, what's the impact on interest rates of this budget?
Well, Andrew, if we went back in the past, go back a couple of years, what we would be looking at to be able to determine where interest rates are going, we have to look at inflation. And the Reserve Bank was always targeting getting inflation between 2 and 3% over an economic cycle. And that would be dictating sort of what it was going to do about interest rates, whether they were going to put them up or put them down. Now it's the unemployment rate, which is the key driver of where interest rates are going. So if you want to know where interest rates are going, watch the job figures, not just the unemployment rate, but things like hours worked, participation rates and the like. Now the federal government has handed down its budget, spending a lot of money, but on its current projections, it still believes that the unemployment rate by June quarter of next year, 2021, is going to be in the order of 7.25%. By June quarter of 2022, it'll be 6.5%. Now, the desire from both the Reserve Bank and also by the government is to get the unemployment rate below 6%. So you can see on the government's own numbers that, so you go through to 2022, we're not going to see unemployment rate below 6%. So what the Reserve Bank governor has already indicated that he expects that interest rates are going to remain unchanged for the next 3 years. So that's good news if you're paying off a loan. You don't want to be sort of saddled with so higher repayments. So people can go about and plan their lives now on the basis that interest rates are going to be stable for quite some time. It's the combined view about the Reserve Bank and also about the government in terms of jobs. Now, the Reserve Bank handed down its interest rate decision yesterday. One of the interesting things that it says that it's an important national priority to get that unemployment rate down. And as I said beforehand, there's a degree of aggression that has to be applied in terms of the jobless rate. We don't want people to be staying jobless for a long period of time because they become less employable over time. We saw that in the past recessions of the 80s and the 90s. Now, could interest rates fall further? Well, they could. What the Reserve Bank said yesterday, the board continues to consider how additional monetary easing could support jobs as the economy opens up further. So they're open the door for the potential that we could see another interest rate cut in November from 25 basis points, or 1/4%, down to 10 basis points. Now, what would it solve? What would it actually prove? Probably prove nothing, because people are not wanting to borrow anyway. But I think one of the things that the Reserve Bank can be doing over time is buying more government securities, particularly longer dated government securities, and getting that yield curve down right the way across the yield curve, not just short-term interest rates out to 3-year, but the longer-term rates as well. So the bottom line from the budget and also from the Reserve Bank, interest rates are going to remain unchanged for a long period of time, and they could actually go lower.
So you're not rushing to fix your interest rates as yet?
Well, as is always the case with interest rates, so some people like fixing rates, and so some people sort of don't just stick with variable rates. Effie can weigh into this debate, but I think what a lot of people would like to do is have half fixed, half variable, and therefore you've got to put in both camps.
Excellent. So, Effie, how do you feel the impact of that recent RBA announcement rate decision was, and what do you think the impact is on the property market and the first home buyers?
Yeah, first of all, just following on with Craig on with whether you'd be locking in right now. I mean, what I'm seeing at the moment, the best rates, even on Canstar's database, they're all fixed rates. Like the lowest 3-year fixed rate now is 1.99, then 2.06 and 2.14. When you look at variable rates, it's as down as 1.89. Now that particular lender requires a 40% deposit, so a lending valuation ratio of 60%. So look, the best deals or the best rates are certainly fixed. I can imagine the banks are probably wanting to lock in their portfolios, know what the amortization is going to be like, and that's where the rates are. For consumers, totally agree with what Craig was saying. It's what makes you sleep best at night, splitting 50-50, understanding what the conditions are on that fixed rate as well, knowing that not all lenders allow you to make extra payments, but the good news is the majority do these days, up to a certain amount. And also for a lot of people who are on mortgage pause, we know a lot of those ended in September, that's 6 months, but that 6 months started from when you called your lender. So there's still a lot of mortgage pause. And these are one of the, I guess, headwinds that the property market is facing. When you look at, say, data from CoreLogic that only came out last week, all states have actually seen a holding or a rise, except for, of course, Sydney and Melbourne, with property prices. So, if I'm going to be negative, we've got mortgages on pause, they've got to be unpaused, so to speak. The sluggish labour market, we've got the wind back of JobKeeper. That could all be really hurtful for the property market. But on the other side, we've heard through the budget, the first home loan deposit scheme expanded, the home builder scheme, low interest rates that we've just talked about, the easing of credit. Now you don't have to justify your Uber Eats, I guess, to a certain extent, or whatever bad money habit you may have, putting the onus to a certain extent back to consumers. But I'm sure banks are going to hold their quality. They want quality lending, of course, as well. So look, the tailwinds may beat the headwinds. So I think the property market is still being supported quite well with these government initiatives. And it has surprised all analysts as to how well they've held the prices.
Excellent. So a little while off before we rush out and fix rates, but the rates are certainly looking very, very good. Craig, there's a lot of talk in this, and I mentioned in the introduction we're going to see debt go out to $1.13 trillion by 2024. How concerned should we be at the size of the debt that we're seeing and is projected?
Andrew, can you?
Well, we've heard the old adage, haven't we? Sort of be alert and not alarmed. And I think that's very much the case we're dealing with in terms of the budget deficit and in terms of debt levels. Now, what's the alternative? We're hit by an outside influence. We're hit by sort of virus that's hitting sort of across the globe. It's certainly seeing our economy going backwards. We can't just sit on our hands and say, well, so there's nothing we can do about it. Certainly, we went into this crisis with a budget which was balanced and 29 consecutive years of economic growth. Unemployment was super low, inflation under control. So if a crisis had to hit us, it hit basically at the right time, and we have the firepower to be able to respond to it. So certainly is a very significant budget deficit. We're talking about almost $214 billion, 11% of GDP. You have to go back to the end of the Second World War to find a deficit, so as big as that is a proportion of GDP. So these are extraordinary times. It takes the extraordinary measures. What the government is trying to do is to be able to dig our way out of it through growth. You can't basically dig your way out of it any other way. What we've got to do is give businesses the ability to keep on working and keep on staying in business, and therefore to be able to have the wherewithal to be able to hire workers and to be able to see that unemployment rate sort of go down. So it's keeping that economy sort of healthy over time. And that's what the government's going to do. Yeah, there are some crazy numbers when we look at sort of debt. If we look at the net debt position, it's around about 36% of GDP. If we look at gross debt, taking away some of the assets that we hold, it's around about 45% of GDP. Now, you have to go back to the end of the 1960s, 1969, to see a higher level of debt as a proportion of GDP. But if you go back so further back into the 50s and 40s and really right the way back to the Federation, we were maintaining high levels of debt for a long period of time. It all gets down to your serviceability, like anything with any individual, any business. Over the next couple of years, we're going to see the debt levels rise quite significantly, but the actual interest rate or net interest paid on that debt isn't going to change greatly over the next 3 or 4 years. It's going to be sitting around about $13 billion. Now, that $13 billion could be sort of implemented elsewhere in the community, but the bottom line is it's not getting any bigger over time. So serviceability of debt remains very, very good. We are in a strong position to be able to service our debt. So when we think of debt, don't think so much in terms of debt and deficits, but think in terms of serviceability as well. And we are in very, very good shape. And as I said beforehand, there's no alternative. We've got to suspend the money, try and grow the economy out of it. Once we get the economy on the straight and narrow, then we can start dealing with debt and deficits. And I suppose what we're going to listen to is the Reserve Bank governor and also the head of the Federal Reserve in the United States. They say, look, so for the time being, we can't worry about these deficits. We can't worry about these debts. We've basically got to get the economy back on its feet, sort of motoring again. And then once we do that, then we can start to worry about the debt situation.
Terrific. It's some reassuring commentary from there. We will start answering your questions that you type in online in a few minutes. Can I ask you to please enter those questions into the Q&A box rather than through the chat? Just before we leave that debt issue, Paul, a lot of debate around the debt and deficit. Different views from both parties. Does this put to rest that debate around who are the better economic managers and the management of surpluses and deficits?
Well, I think if you could prescind from politics, you'd have to say yes, but you can't prescind from politics. And I guess it's part of the DNA of the liberal side of the political spectrum to own the mantle of better economic managers. So they would say that, okay, so we've now got record debt, but we'll handle it. We would handle it much better, obviously, than Labor ever would. And interestingly, if you look back at the record of Labor in government, it could make claims to be as good as the Liberals, depending on the circumstances of the time. And what we've got now, of course, is a situation, as Craig James and many other economists, in fact, all other reputable economists say, this is affordable debt. And in fact, we've never had cheaper debt for as long as we can remember, basically. So I don't think we're going to see a debt truck. Some of you might remember the Howard opposition had a debt truck. That was something it tried to throw at the Rudd opposition, but failed. I don't think the Liberals will be hiring a debt truck anytime soon. And I noticed that Labor last night, in its response to the to the budget was not complaining about the size of the deficit, but it was complaining about whether the Treasurer had come up with enough bang for the bucks he was borrowing.
Terrific. Thank you for that, Paul. Now we're going to start jumping into some of our tax questions. Yeah, Tony, if I could put one out to you first. This carry-back rule for tax losses has been tried previously, most recently in 2013, but it was quickly rescinded. How do you see it operating, and how can businesses make the most of this unique situation?
Well, firstly, Andrew, the carryback rule that was introduced earlier, the 2013 version of it, was linked to the MRRT, which didn't have a very long life. So one of the reasons it was rescinded back then was that the benefits were supposedly being paid for by that MRRT policy. Now, that didn't mean that it was bad policy. It probably is a policy for a recession. In terms of how this one operates, it's a little bit different to the last one. This one allows you to carry your losses back up to 3 years from 2022 all the way back to the 2018-19 years. So if you're tax paying, it does give you back in those years or later years, it does give you a little bit of flexibility around how you can claim some losses against previous year's tax. I suppose one of the sting in the tail is that it doesn't actually kick in until you lodge your 2021 tax return. So you're not going to see tax refunds coming through for some time just yet. So it's not the immediate cash kicker that it perhaps could have been if companies were allowed to start amending and claiming a tax offset immediately. They're going to have to wait. So the earliest, on our reckoning, the earliest that companies would be able to start claiming is probably early in the new year. But only if you're a December company. So there are a few conditions around it. Generally, we think it's a good policy for the current environment, but it's going to have some complexity attached to it as well.
Excellent, thank you. Effie, we're getting a number of questions through on this $200 a week incentive. How's that going to operate with state-based incentives that are already available? Effie, I'll just get you one mute there.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Happens to all of us.
A bit pro at that, actually. So from my understanding on the job maker side, that $200 credit, if you're receiving the job keeper, you can't get both, as my understanding is of that. There's also quite a bit of eligibility from both the employer side and the employee side. There is a job number count as well, how many people you have. So if you're a new business, as for example, and you're starting out now and you have got no employee at this stage, you can't put the first one on and get that $200 credit or $100 credit would be. So there is there are definitely some conditions around the actual availability of that money.
Okay. Tony, a number of questions there on the instant asset write-off. Can you explain what kind of assets are eligible? For example, are buildings eligible for this write-off?
Andrew, yes, the instant asset write-off is limited to only those assets that are typically depreciable assets. And so it won't include buildings, it'll only include plant and equipment that you would normally claim capital allowances under Division 40. So it is limited in that sense. I note in the question box is also the question raised about whether or not it could include software projects and software being implemented. Again, I'd draw it back to that question of whether your software is an asset that's capable of being depreciated. That would mean that it would need to be in-house software as defined under the tax law rather than something that you're creating to market as a software seller or licensor of that software. So again, the key definition is it plant and equipment that's typically depreciable under the Division 40 rules as they've always applied.
Okay, so this is our next question for Craig, and probably particularly pertinent to those living here in Canberra. With this deficit ballooning, are we likely to see more public service cuts?
In this sort of environment, no. It's the case that what we want to see is more jobs being created, not less, fewer jobs being created. So certainly wouldn't see that at all. We've got the small matter, I believe, an election coming up in the ACT, so you're not going to see anything in the short term either. And I think, it's very much for the longer term. You can just imagine if a state or territory government or a federal government starts cutting jobs in this sort of environment, it wouldn't be sort of a good look, given that the federal, state and territory governments are committed to be able to get more people, in work. So I wouldn't expect to see something like that. I suppose stranger things have happened. We've seen that this year with a virus coming out of the blue. But so I think in this sort of environment, it's all about job creation rather than job cuts.
All right. So, Craig, while I've got you there, I might as well ask you this one. We've been asked a couple of questions about, are we going to fall off a cliff if these stimulus measures don't work?
Fall off a cliff, I don't think so. I mean, we've got to remember that, we've had some pretty smart minds that come up with these measures, over time, and they're well aware of the risks as well as the opportunities. So there's opportunities with these measures that are being put in place, but so there's risk in taking off too early. Now, clearly, so it is a judgment. So the pandemic came along, and unfortunately, 100 years ago, they didn't leave us a playbook. They didn't say this is exactly what you should be doing in this sort of environment. So, unfortunately, so in terms of the timing of the measures, winding back of the measures, and sort of easing off on the payments, we're very much left to ourselves. But I think in the current environment, what's clear from the government, from the federal government, and also from state and territory government, is the aggression that they're applying in terms of providing stimulus to the system. And I don't think they're going to be aggressive in the other way in terms of winding back that assistance. So I would expect to see sort of tapering of any assistance that's being provided sort of over time. They've got to be guided by the situation. When we think about things like JobKeeper and Job Seeker, a lot of people believe so just bump up JobKeeper payments and Job Seeker payments. But the last thing that you want to do is to be able to create a welfare class, to be able to leave those people quite happily, sort of sitting in terms of their unemployment benefits. So on the one hand, we've got to basically ensure that people sort of are supported through this environment. The other side of the equation, we want to make sure that people don't stay out of the job market for too long. And that's the fine line that the federal and state governments have got to do in terms of measuring this situation. I've heard of examples already in terms of those people on JobKeeper that saying, this is a wonderful situation, a few more payments like this and I've got a deposit from my house. And that's serious. That's the case that, yes, they are looking to be able to apply that. Certainly, a number of examples of people that so getting super compensated, getting more on JobKeeper than what they had in their previous job. So we've always got to be careful with these sorts of things to make sure that the right incentives are in place, as well as providing the right degree of support for individuals.
Excellent. So, Tony, just a quick question on the FBT regulations, and will there be any changes specifically to dining and entertainment?
Well, Andrew, we were certainly looking closely for this because in Melbourne we're hoping for a big resurgence of certainly outdoor dining, and Friday lunches coming back with a vengeance, but unfortunately we were sorely disappointed that we haven't seen anything on that front as yet. It'll be interesting to see whether anything gets ventured in future in that area. Probably the main change that could still be seen is something around simplification. I think particularly again for small to mid-sized businesses. Unfortunately, the budget didn't provide that on this occasion.
Yeah, while I've got you there, Tony, we've got some questions around the instant asset write-off and eligibility. Is this only for companies, or can sole traders access this concession as well?
Yes, the instant asset write-off concession is broadly available to a range of different entities and structures that are in business. So it will apply to your traditional corporate or indeed a business being carried on through a partnership or a sole trader. So the important aspect is that you've got something that would otherwise be depreciable under the Division 40 rules, and provided you can, then you'll be in the instant asset rules. Importantly, for small to mid-sized businesses, that can extend to second-hand plant as well. So that's got a threshold cut off for companies with or entities with turnover up to 50 million. You can include second-hand plant in that. So it does give a pretty broad range of potential options for businesses, no matter what their structure.
Yeah. So, Effie, we've certainly seen a lot of uncertainty and a lot of uncertainty about the future. Based on this budget and some of the superannuation incentives, are you a big fan of super moving forward?
I personally am. I mean, I've gone on record to still say that for most Aussies is probably one of the most wealth-creating strategies that we've got. It ticks all the boxes for long-term wealth, dollar cost averaging, your tax perks. It would be interesting to see what does come out from the retirement income review, which the government is still sitting on that. What did surprise me with the budget is, first of all, that they've moved into this space of monitoring what I call dud super funds, as they do themselves, and also the establishment of a super comparison platform. That will be interesting to see how that goes through. No doubt consumers can do a lot better with how much fees we are paying, a ridiculous amount. To me, that indicates they may be going ahead with the increase in the SG contributions. I mean, that's hotly debated. You know, do we increase it? Is it stopping from wages happening, increasing wages? I think for most Aussies, what we've learned is that we don't have an emergency fund. We used our super for this. Super really saved a lot of people. It's a cost that's costing ourselves, so to speak. And I think the interest now for all generations in super is at its highest, whether it is how do I access my money, or how do I build it back up again, or do I still want this or I don't want this. There's a huge amount of interest in super and a lot riding on it.
So Paul, I'll direct a question to you. We did really start off this crisis not with the COVID-19, but with the bushfires. Do you believe that the government has learnt its lessons from how it handled the bushfires?
Well, if we take the budget as any guide, they seem to want to put that behind them. In the budget papers, of course, the announcements that were made in response to the bushfire crisis have been funded. They are there. We are going to get more aerial firefighting, and we've got the disaster relief fund is all there. But there was no shaping in the budget of bushfires in terms of climate change. There was no acknowledgement, if you like, that one of the biggest economic disasters that we've had in the last 12 months was the bushfire, and that experts, including firefighting experts, have said to the government, or the government, state and federal, that we have to get more real in the way we're responding to climate change. And there was nothing in this budget that showed that this government was any more serious about that than it has been for a long time.
So you believe that it could have been a little targeted in areas like climate change and other areas of renewable energy and different kinds of spending?
Yeah, precisely. And in fact, I think that the budget itself should have been framed in a more forward-looking way. We're talking about the future of our nation, or of our country, and of our planet. and there was no framing at all. Unlike what you would get, or unlike what the Macron government, for example, did in France, or does in France with its budgets. And indeed, even in Britain, the British Conservative governments frame their budgets also in terms of dealing with climate change and the effect it's going to have on the economy and the economies of the world going forward.
Thank you for that, Paul. Now, moving back to a very practical tax question. The average tax cut is going to be about $200 per month. What's your advice for those paying PAYG instalments? Should they be reducing their PAYG instalments?
Andrew, I'm going to have to declare that I haven't looked into the regulations in detail to see how this is going to be administered. I think that's probably something that we'll look at over the coming days to see how the detail of how the implementation of the tax cuts and the bringing those back to 1 July will actually be implemented in practice, whether that will allow companies to slow down their PAYG instalments and deductions going forward in order to meet the tax changes, and or how that will be implemented by way of a refund in other circumstances remains to be seen. So we'll again have a look at the detail and have a better idea as to how that will be implemented.
Excellent. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, we still have time for questions. Please enter them into the Q&A function on Zoom. All of this detail is also covered in our RSM Federal Budget Report. If you follow the link in the comments section, you can download that free report. Now, I'll go back over to you, Craig. We're getting questions here about how is all this debt going to be funded? Where's the money going to come from?
Well, basically through economic growth. So there's a couple of ways that you can be able to pay back your debt. So you could sort of significantly increase taxes, or you can cut your payments or spending in the economy, and that's certainly one way to be able to address your deficit and your debt situation. But basically what any business knows, if you keep on cutting, what you do is going to get progressively smaller in size. Doesn't mean to say that you're going to increase your survival rate or increase your possibility of even growing and gaining some market share over time. So the important thing is to be able to get the economy back on its feet and growing again. And if you've got the economy growing again at something like a 3% annual rate, eventually, what you're going to do is chip away, so that debt over time. What you need is to provide incentives for businesses to be able to spend, invest, and employ. What you need to have incentives for people to be able to spend their money and also retain more of the money. And that's where we've talked about tax reform in this situation. Just imagine a situation where we had a GST rate of 15%, a little bit higher in terms of the GST, but basically you had a flat personal tax structure of say 20 cents in the dollar, 25 cents in the dollar. A lot of people would say that it just improves the incentivization in terms of the economy. The harder and stronger and more efficiently you work and get onto higher income levels, the more that you're able to retain more of your income. So that's why we are recommending to the government to be able to do more in terms of that tax way, get things rid of things like stamp duty, get rid of things like payroll tax, get a flat tax structure coming in terms of personal taxation, and increase things like the GST rate, and give people the incentive and the ability to be able to choose. The government's made it very, very clear that this is the way that it wants to address the deficit and debt levels, over time, by getting the economy back on its feet, getting the economy growing over time, and getting a consistency. What we saw in terms of when we had the Howard Costello years, and more recently in terms of the coalition government, a long period of prosperity sees a substantial improvement in the budget deficit in a very, very short space of time, but you need that consistency in terms of growth.
Thanks, Craig. It seems that economists can do wonders with, even more wonders than accountants can with numbers, particularly given enough assumptions. What's your view on some of the assumptions underlying this budget? And in particular, we're being asked a lot about what happens if there's no virus or a vaccine for the virus within the next year.
It is an interesting one. There is an assumption in the budget papers that a vaccine will be freely available by the end of 2021. And certainly that's one of the assumptions what the federal government is working on. So for this current financial year that we're in, the expectation from the government is a contraction in the economy of 1.5%. So that's not too different from the Commonwealth Bank view or the Commonwealth Bank Group view of a 1.6% fall. But where the difference comes in over the next year, the 21-22 year, the expectation is the growth in the economy is going to ratchet up to the order of 4.75%. Certainly that's not our expectation at the Commonwealth Bank Group. We're more looking at 3.5% rather than 4.75%. So that's where it can affect outcomes in the out years. But the problem, I suppose, at the moment, if you're making forecasts anything longer than about 3 or 6 months out, how good are those forecasts likely to be? So I think the assumptions that they've built in the model for this current financial year are appropriate and indeed very, very much achievable. In some ways, quite conservative. One of the assumptions that I also put in the budget is in terms of the iron ore price, and the assumption is that the iron ore price is going to ratchet down significantly over the remaining months of this year to around about $55 a tonne. Well, it's consistently remained above that, in fact, the current rate is $123, per tonne. So that's where the government is being a little bit conservative in terms of its numbers. But we're going to continue to get that income coming through from iron ore. Thankfully, we've got the Chinese economy, which is actually progressing quite nicely at the moment. They're beefing up their economy, expanding the infrastructure programs, and of course that's demanding our raw materials here in Australia. And of course a key one in terms of steel making is in terms of iron ore. So we would have too many quibbles in the short-term forecast from the federal government. That one for the next financial year is something that will change over time, but so just acknowledging the fact they're probably a little bit more aggressive than most economists in terms of their view. Now, you at RSM have had a bit of a commercial in terms of your own document. If you go to commsec.com.au/budget, you'll see our economic contribution to the budget, so our report as well. So read the RSM report, but read our report, as well. That will give you some of the economic numbers that I've been talking about today.
Yeah, fantastic, Craig. There's certainly a lot of interest in the economics surrounding this budget, and the CBA report is normally a terrific read. The RSM report will focus really on the taxation implications, and go ahead, read the CBA one. It'll be a great read. Time for probably a final question to Tony. We're getting a few questions, Tony, just to clarify the rules around second-hand assets. Can you just clarify second-hand assets and the instant asset write-off?
Yeah, sure. So the ability to claim the instant asset write-off for a second-hand asset is again tied to firstly whether that asset is otherwise plant and equipment that would be capable of depreciation under the Division 40 rules. The issue though is that a threshold has been set for only certain companies that have a turnover of under 50 million are able to claim the instant asset write-off on second-hand plan. So it's really around that threshold where that cuts in. In terms of the eligibility more generally for the instant asset write-off, it needs to be acquired and installed ready for use by 30 June 2022. So that's the other thing for everyone to take note of, that this is an incentive that has a short lifespan. So it's only for assets that are acquired from after 7:30 last night and any time through to 30 June 2022. So again, look at in terms of your own business position and your eligibility from a turnover perspective to apply it to second-hand plant. If you're under the threshold, then you should be able to take advantage of that concession.
Okay, so just a little more detail on that, Tony. Motor vehicles, are we still subject to the luxury car limit on motor vehicle purchases?
Andrew, I know what you've got in mind, and put those thoughts aside. Unfortunately, I'd expect they're going to apply in the same way as previously, that there'll be a cut-off. So you'll only be able to claim the instant asset write-off up to the limit of the usual luxury car limit. I haven't seen the specific regulations on it, but I'd be almost certain that they will replicate the same restrictions. That's certainly been a rule that's applied under the instant asset rule since it was introduced a budget or two ago. So yeah, unfortunately, Andrew, not this time around.
Okay. Now, you mentioned in your answer before that an asset acquired after 7:30 p.m. last night. So when you say acquired, if I'd entered into a contract to purchase an asset last week and it's not delivered till tomorrow, will that meet the definition of acquired, or do I need to enter into a contract after 7:30 p.m. last night?
That's a really good question, and it's going to depend on the specific contract and whether it was effectively entered into before that date or not. So you'd have to look at whether whether it should be viewed as a contract that has been completed prior to that date. The rules, again, the devil might be in the detail here, Andrew, but I'd expect that it would only apply to contracts entered into after that date. Interestingly, the existing instant asset write-off rules will continue to apply as they had previously with their existing threshold. So if you don't fall within the new rules, you might still fall within the existing rules, which apply for assets acquired and installed ready for use until the end of this calendar year. But outside of that, in order to get into the new rules, you'd have to be contracting to acquire the asset after last night.
Okay, and just a final question before we wrap it up, and it's for you again, Tony. You've used the term a couple of times, installed and ready for use. So that means that the asset would have to be delivered by 30 June 2022 or just contracted for?
No, I think this has been a mainstay of the corporate tax rules for some time, that where you if you're going to claim depreciation on an asset, it must be installed and ready for use, not just contracted. So unfortunately, it's not enough to go out on 30 June and pen a contract for a new asset. You've got to actually have the asset in place. It doesn't need to have actually been used at that date, as long as it's actually been installed and is ready to operate. So you've got to tick a few more boxes, unfortunately, but there's plenty of time for people to get on top of that. But of course, I'd have to end by saying, if you're not sure, please reach out to your RSM tax advisor to get some input on that.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Tony. You can also download our free budget report as well, and that will have plenty of detail on some of those measures that have been announced. I'd like to thank the support of the team at RSM, Tony and his team, who stayed up most of last night. I think the last email I got was at 5:25 this morning from the team, putting together that report. I'd also like to thank our external presenters, Craig James from CommSec, generously appeared for us, Effie Zahos from Canstar, and of course Paul Bongiorno. Thank you all very much for taking the time to review and watch our webinar. If you have any further questions, go to the RSM website. You can type in questions into our query function there, and we can come back to you with any answers. Thank you for your attendance today.